I had heard the stories. Everyone had. Tales of the Pilliga Princess, the spirit of an aboriginal woman who wandered the Newell Highway at night, pushing a rusted shopping trolley through the dark stretches of the bushland. They said she appeared out of nowhere, her face pale as the moonlight that occasionally broke through the trees. The locals warned travelers to be careful, but I never believed in such things, until that night. I was driving south on the Newell Highway, the road stretching endlessly before me, swallowed by the shadows of the dense, tangled trees on either side. It was a lonely stretch, miles from the nearest town, and the only light came from my headlights, carving a narrow path through the darkness. The air was thick, and the smell of eucalyptus and dust filled my car. I felt a strange heaviness in my chest, a sense that something wasn't quite right, but I shrugged it off as the fatigue of a long drive. Then I saw her. At first, it was just a glimpse, a figure on the side of the road shrouded in shadows. I blinked, thinking it was a trick of the light, but as I drew closer, I saw her clearly. She was standing there barefoot on the asphalt, her hair wild and dark with a faded dress clinging to her frame. Her eyes were fixed straight ahead, as if she didn't see me at all, and in her hands she pushed a rusty shopping trolley, the kind you'd find abandoned behind a grocery store. A chill ran down my spine. I didn't know why, but I felt a sudden, overwhelming urge to stop the car, to roll down the window and ask if she needed help. But something held me back. Maybe it was the way she stood so still, too still, like she was frozen in time. Or maybe it was the faint smile on her lips that didn't reach her eyes. As I passed her, I glanced in the rearview mirror. She was gone. The road behind me was empty, just the endless stretch of black tar and the dark wall of the bush. I felt my heart start to race. Did I imagine her? Was I so tired that I was seeing things? But I knew deep down that she had been real, or at least, she had been there. The air inside the car grew colder and I shivered even though the heater was on. I checked the mirror again. Still nothing, just darkness. I told myself to keep driving, to focus on the road ahead. But I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong, that I wasn't alone. Suddenly a sharp noise broke the silence. It was faint but unmistakable, the squeak of a rusty wheel turning, coming from somewhere behind me. I glanced in the mirror again, my hands gripping the steering wheel tight. There was nothing, just the road stretching back into the shadows. But the sound grew louder, closer, the soft, rhythmic squeak of a trolley being pushed along the asphalt. My breath caught in my throat. I knew I shouldn't look, but I couldn't help it. I looked again, and there she was, the Pilliga Princess standing in the middle of the road, pushing her trolley. Her face was expressionless, her eyes fixed straight ahead, unblinking. The smile on her lips seemed to grow wider, more unnatural. My heart pounded in my chest, and I could feel the cold sweat forming on my forehead. I wanted to scream, but no sound came out. I slammed my foot on the accelerator, trying to get away, to leave her behind. The car sped up, the engine roaring, but the squeaking of the trolley continued, keeping pace with me. It was impossible. I was driving fast, too fast, but the sound was still there, still following me. And then, just as suddenly as it had started, it stopped. The car's interior grew warmer again, and the cold in my chest faded. I glanced in the mirror one last time. Nothing. The road was empty, the bush quiet, as if nothing had happened. But I knew better. I knew she was still out there, somewhere in the dark, waiting for her next traveler, her next victim. I drove on, my hands trembling on the wheel, my eyes fixed straight ahead. The stories were true, all of them. And now, I was part of them too. I'd seen the Pilliga Princess, and I knew I would never forget of her haunting smile, or the sound of that rusty trolley echoing through the night. I tried to shake off the strange feeling as I drove, but I couldn't stop thinking about the woman I had seen. The night seemed darker now, the shadows deeper, and the road stretched on endlessly before me. I turned up the radio to drown out my thoughts, but all I got was static. No music, no voices, just the low, crackling hum that filled the car, like a whisper I couldn't quite hear. I glanced in the rearview mirror again, almost against my will. The road was still empty, just my own taillights fading into the dark. I let out a breath I didn't realize I was holding. Maybe it was all in my head. Maybe I was just tired. But then I heard it. A faint squeak, like a wheel turning slowly, somewhere behind me. My hands tightened on the steering wheel and I felt my heart start to race again. I told myself it was nothing, maybe just the sound of my tires on the road, but the squeak grew louder, closer, like it was following me. I checked the mirror again, but there was still nothing, just the endless highway, stretching back into the night. My mouth was dry, and I swallowed hard, trying to calm myself down. I decided to pull over, just for a moment, to catch my breath and maybe shake off this feeling of unease. As I pulled to the side of the road, I saw something on the ground, right in front of my car. It was a small piece of paper, fluttering slightly in the breeze. I hesitated, but then I opened the door and stepped out. The air outside was cold, colder than it should have been, and a shiver ran down my spine. I reached down and picked up the paper. It was an old receipt, yellowed and torn, like it had been out here for years. I looked closer and saw that it was from a grocery store. The date was smudged, but the name on the receipt was clear. It was my name. My heart skipped a beat, and I dropped the paper like it had burned me. I stepped back, my breath coming in short, sharp gasps. I tried to tell myself it was a coincidence, that maybe someone else had the same name, but I knew that wasn't true. I could feel it deep in my bones, a cold certainty that chilled me to the core. I turned to get back in the car, but then I saw her again. She was standing just a few feet away, at the edge of the road, her eyes fixed on me. The same woman, the same faded dress, and the same rusty shopping trolley. She wasn't moving, just staring, her face blank and emotionless. I froze, unable to look away. She took a step forward, and the trolley's wheels squeaked loudly, breaking the heavy silence. The sound made me jump, and I stumbled back, almost tripping over my own feet. My heart was pounding in my chest, and I could feel sweat trickling down my back despite the cold. "What do you want?" I whispered, my voice barely audible. She didn't answer, didn't even blink. She just kept coming, one slow step after another, the squeak of the trolley echoing in the still night air. I scrambled back into the car, slamming the door shut and locking it. My hands were shaking so badly, I could barely grip the wheel. I started the engine and floored the gas pedal, the tires screeching as I sped off. The car lurched forward, and for a moment I felt a surge of relief. But then, in the rearview mirror, I saw her again. She was standing in the middle of the road, still pushing the trolley, still staring at me with that same blank expression. The road stretched on, and the distance between us grew, but her figure stayed in the mirror, never fading, never getting smaller. The squeaking sound of the trolley's wheels was still there, louder now, closer. I pressed down harder on the gas, my hands gripping the wheel so tightly my knuckles turned white. The car sped down the highway, but the sound didn't stop. It was as if the squeak was inside my head now, echoing with every beat of my racing heart. I tried to focus on the road, tried to tell myself it wasn't real, that it couldn't be real. But the cold air in the car, the static on the radio, the receipt with my name, it all pointed to one thing. The Pilliga Princess was real, and she was here, with me, and she wasn't going to let me go. Then the radio crackled to life. Static filled the car, and through the crackling I heard it again, the soft, faint whisper of her voice. This time, it was clearer. She was singing, a sad, haunting tune that sent shivers down my spine. It sounded like a lullaby, but twisted and distorted, like something from a nightmare. I reached for the radio dial, desperate to turn it off, but the knob wouldn't budge. Her voice grew louder, filling the car, filling my head, and then I saw her. In the rearview mirror, she was sitting in the back seat, her eyes fixed on me, her face pale, and gaunt. She was so close I could see the dirt on her cheeks, the matted hair falling around her face. She opened her mouth, and the lullaby stopped. She whispered, "You can't leave. You're mine now." I screamed, slamming my hands over my eyes, but when I opened them again, she was gone. The car was still, the radio silent. The trolley was nowhere to be seen, but I knew she was still there, lurking just out of sight, waiting. I tried the engine one last time. It roared to life, and I hit the gas, tearing down the highway as fast as I could. But even as I drove, I couldn't shake the feeling that she was with me, that I'd never really escape. The Pilliga Princess had chosen me, and I knew deep down that no matter how far I ran, I would never be free. The car sped down the highway, the engine roaring as I pushed it to its limits. But no matter how fast I went, I could feel her presence closing in around me. The air grew colder again, almost freezing, and I could see my breath misting in front of me. My hands were trembling on the steering wheel, and I kept glancing in the mirror, half expecting to see her face staring back at me. And then the headlights flickered, just for a moment, but long enough to make my heart skip a beat. They flickered again, longer this time, plunging me into darkness for a split second before flaring back to life. I felt panic rising in my chest. I gripped the steering wheel tighter, trying to keep my eyes on the road, but the lights kept flickering, shorter and shorter, until they finally went out completely. I was driving blind. I slammed my foot on the brakes, the tires screeching as the car skidded to a stop. My heart pounded in my chest, and I sat there, gripping the wheel, my breath coming in short, sharp gasps. The darkness was complete, thick and suffocating. I couldn't see anything beyond the windshield, just blackness stretching out in every direction. And then, in the stillness, I heard it. The sound of footsteps, slow and deliberate, coming toward the car. I strained to see through the darkness, my eyes wide and searching, but there was nothing. Just the footsteps, getting closer and closer. And then I felt it, a cold hand, brushing against my shoulder. I jumped, turning sharply, but there was no one there. The air was freezing, so cold it hurt to breathe, and I could see the frost forming on the inside of the windows. The footsteps stopped, and for a moment, everything was silent. I could hear my own heartbeat, loud in my ears, and then I saw her. She was standing right outside the car, just inches from the window, her face pressed against the glass. Her eyes were wide and empty, her lips moving, but no sound came out. She lifted her hand and pressed it against the glass, and I could see the frost spreading from her fingers, crawling across the window like spider webs. My heart pounded in my chest, and I could barely breathe. I knew I should move, should start the car and drive, but I was frozen in place, trapped by her gaze. She leaned closer, her face just inches from mine, separated only by the thin sheet of glass. Her lips moved again, and this time I heard it, a whisper, soft and broken, "Help me." Her voice was so faint, so filled with pain, that for a moment I almost felt sorry for her. But then I saw her eyes, empty, black pits that seemed to go on forever. The sympathy turned to fear, sharp and cold, cutting through my chest. I jerked back, my hands fumbling for the door handle. But before I could move, she reached through the glass. Her hand passed through, as if it wasn't even there, and I felt her fingers brush against my skin, cold as ice. I gasped, a sharp, terrified sound escaping my lips. Her hand closed around my wrist, her grip like a vice. The cold spread through my arm, numbing it, and I felt a pressure in my chest, like I couldn't breathe. I tried to pull away, but her grip tightened, pulling me closer. "Help me," she whispered again, louder this time, more insistent. Her eyes bore into mine, and I felt a strange pull, like she was drawing me in, pulling me down into that darkness. My vision blurred, and I could feel myself slipping, falling. "No!" I screamed, yanking my arm back with all my strength. Her hand slipped, and I fell back into my seat, gasping for air. The cold began to fade, and I blinked, my vision clearing. She was still there, outside the car, but her face was different now, angry, twisted with rage. "You can't leave," she hissed, her voice no longer a whisper, but a sharp, cutting sound that echoed through the car. She slammed her hand against the window, and I saw cracks spidering out from where her fingers touched the glass. Panic surged through me. I twisted the key in the ignition, praying the car would start. The engine sputtered once, twice, and then roared to life. I floored the gas pedal, the tires screeching as I tore away from the side of the road. In the rearview mirror, I saw her standing there, her face twisted in fury, her mouth open in a silent scream. The cold began to fade as I sped down the highway, my heart racing, my breath coming in short, sharp gasps. I knew I had escaped her for now, but her words echoed in my mind, a haunting reminder of the darkness that lingered on that lonely stretch of road. "You can't leave." I drove on, my hands shaking, my eyes flicking to the mirror again and again, half expecting to see her there, still following, still waiting. I knew I was far from safe. The Pilliga Princess had made her choice, and she wasn't done with me yet. The car roared down the highway, but my heart was pounding louder than the engine. I kept glancing in the rearview mirror, expecting to see her pale face staring back at me, but the road behind was empty, swallowed by darkness. For a moment I dared to hope that it was over, that I had escaped her grasp. But then the car began to slow down on its own. The gas pedal felt heavy, like it was pushing back against my foot. Panic surged through me again, and I pressed harder, but the car continued to slow, coming to a gradual stop in the middle of the empty highway. I slammed my fist against the wheel in frustration, shouting, "No, not now!" But the car wouldn't move. The engine died with a sputter, and the headlights flickered once more before going out completely, leaving me in pitch blackness. My breath came in short, ragged gasps, and the cold crept back in, colder than before. I felt it wrap around me, squeezing like a vice. And then I heard it. The sound of wheels, squeaking slowly, steadily, getting closer. My heart sank. I turned, peering out into the darkness, and there she was. The Pilliga Princess stood right in the middle of the road, pushing her rusty shopping trolley toward me, her face twisted with anger and pain. Her eyes glowed faintly in the dark, and her mouth moved silently, like she was chanting something. I felt a cold breeze rush through the car, even though the windows were shut. The air grew thick, heavy, pressing down on me from all sides. The trolley's squeak grew louder, sharper, like a scream. I tried to open the car door, but it wouldn't budge. I yanked harder, but it was like something was holding it shut, trapping me inside. The trolley was right in front of the car now, and she stopped, staring at me through the windshield. Her eyes were dark, bottomless, filled with something I couldn't understand. Rage, sorrow, something beyond this world. Her mouth opened wide, wider than it should have been possible, and a horrible, ear-splitting scream filled the air. It was like 1,000 voices all crying out at once, and I felt it vibrate through my bones, rattling my teeth. I covered my ears, trying to block out the sound, but it was everywhere, inside my head, shaking me to my core. The car began to shake violently, the windows rattling, the dashboard lights flickering wildly. I tried to scream, but no sound came out, my voice swallowed by her shriek. The windshield began to crack, spidering out from the center, and I knew I had to get out, now. I grabbed the door handle again, yanking with all my strength, and this time, it flew open. I stumbled out into the cold night, falling to my knees, my heart racing. I tried to stand, but the ground was shaking beneath me like an earthquake. The sound of her scream was deafening, a high-pitched wail that pierced through my skull. I turned to run, but before I could move, I felt something cold wrap around my ankle. I looked down and saw her hand, her cold, dead hand, gripping me tight, pulling me back. "No, let go!" I shouted, kicking at her, but her grip only tightened. I fell backward, my hands scrambling in the dirt, trying to find something to hold on to. I could feel her pulling me closer, dragging me towards the trolley, toward her. Her face was inches from mine now, her breath cold and rancid against my skin. "You will stay," she whispered, her voice a low, growling sound that seemed to echo in the air. "Stay with me, forever." "No," I screamed, feeling the panic rise up in my chest like a tidal wave. I kicked out again, harder this time, and her grip loosened just enough for me to pull free. I scrambled to my feet, turning and running as fast as I could down the highway. The ground trembled beneath me, and I could hear her footsteps, fast and heavy, chasing after me. I didn't dare look back. I just kept running, my breath coming in ragged gasps, my heart pounding in my ears. The road seemed to stretch on forever, and I felt like I was running in place, like I would never escape. And then I saw it. A light, faint but growing brighter. A car coming toward me, headlights cutting through the dark. I waved my arms frantically, shouting for help, my voice hoarse and desperate. The car slowed, the headlights blinding me for a moment, and I stumbled toward it, nearly collapsing with relief. But as I reached the car, I saw her reflection in the windshield, her face twisted with rage, her eyes blazing. She was right behind me, her hand reaching out. I turned, ready to fight, but she stopped, just inches away, her expression shifting, softening. "Please," she whispered, her voice broken, desperate. "Help me." I hesitated, my heart pounding. I didn't understand, but there was something in her eyes, something human, something lost. Before I could react, she faded away, like smoke in the wind, leaving only the cold night air and the distant sound of a trolley wheel squeaking in the dark. The car door opened, and a man stepped out, asking if I was okay. I nodded, my legs weak, my body trembling. I didn't know what had just happened, but I knew one thing for sure. I'd come face to face with the Pilliga Princess, and she had let me go. For now. I stood there, panting, staring at the spot where she had vanished. The cold air still clung to my skin, and I could feel my heart racing, but there was something different now, something that hadn't been there before. Her final words echoed in my mind. "Help me." She hadn't been trying to hurt me. She wanted something that had kept her trapped here, wandering this dark highway, lost and alone. The man from the car, looking concerned, asked if I needed help. I nodded, but my mind was racing, piecing together the fragments of her story. The old tales, the warnings, her appearances. She was searching for something, or maybe someone. I needed to find out what. I asked the man if he knew the nearest town. He mentioned a small one, about 10 miles away. It was close to where I had first seen her. I got into his car, thanking him, and he agreed to drive me there. As we sped down the highway, the squeaking of the trolley still echoed in my mind, and I knew I had to find the answer before she returned. When we reached the town, I headed straight for the local pub, a place where stories like hers might be told. Inside, the dim lights and low murmur of voices made it feel like stepping back in time. I approached the bartender, an older man with a weathered face, and asked him about the Pilliga Princess. At the mention of her name, his eyes darkened, and he leaned in closer. "She's been haunting this road for years," he said in a low voice. "An Aboriginal woman. Her name was lost, but they say she was waiting for someone or something. She died, tragically, but no one knows how. Folks see her pushing that trolley, always moving, never stopping." I asked him if he knew where she might have lived, and he pointed me to an old abandoned shack at the edge of town, where they said she used to stay. I felt a chill run down my spine, but I knew I had to go there. I thanked him and made my way out into the cold night, feeling the weight of her presence still lingering around me. The shack was easy to find, an old dilapidated building at the end of a dirt road, half hidden by the overgrown bush. The door was hanging off its hinges and the windows were broken. I stepped inside, my footsteps echoing on the wooden floor. The air was thick with dust, and I could feel her there, watching, waiting. I searched the small room looking for something, anything that might explain her torment. Then in the corner I saw it, an old photograph, faded and torn, lying on the ground. I picked it up and looked closely. It was of a young woman, her face sad but beautiful, standing next to a small child. The child's eyes were wide and bright, full of life. And then I understood. She was looking for her child. I held the photograph tightly, feeling a lump in my throat. I whispered into the still air, "Is this what you were looking for? Is this why you've been haunting the highway?" The room felt colder for a moment, and I heard the faint sound of the trolley wheels again. But this time, it was softer, almost gentle, almost. I placed the photograph on a small table, and suddenly, the room seemed to lighten, the cold lifting slightly. I could feel her presence, but it wasn't angry or vengeful anymore. It was like she was watching, waiting. I took a deep breath and whispered, "I'm sorry. I hope you find peace now." For a moment, nothing happened, and I wondered if I had been wrong. But then, the photograph seemed to shimmer in the dim light, and a soft breeze swept through the shack, carrying with it a faint whisper, "Thank you." And just like that, the air grew warm again. The feeling of heaviness lifted, and I knew she was gone, finally at rest. I stood there, my heart still racing, but I felt a strange calm wash over me. I knew the haunting was over. The Pilliga Princess had found what she was searching for, and now she could move on. As I left the shack, the wind rustled through the trees, and I felt a soft, comforting presence around me, like a final farewell. I drove back down the highway, the moon shining bright overhead, and for the first time, I felt safe. The road was quiet, and the darkness didn't seem so threatening anymore. But as I drove away, I knew I would never forget her. The woman on the highway with the rusty trolley, her sad, searching eyes, and her haunting plea for help. The stories were true, but now they had an ending, and so did she. I might have escaped the haunting, but a part of her story would always stay with me. A reminder that some souls only need to be heard, to be helped, before they can find their way home. Even now, days after leaving that lonely stretch of highway, I can't shake the feeling that something still lingers with me. I've tried to move on, tried to forget the face of the Pilliga Princess, her hollow eyes, and that haunting whisper. But it's no use. Every time I close my eyes, I see her standing there, pushing that rusty shopping trolley through the dark, endless night. At first I told myself it was over, that by finding her photograph and giving her peace I had done my part. But the shadows in my room seem longer now, stretching and twisting into shapes that don't quite make sense. Sometimes in the stillness of the night, I hear a soft squeak, like a wheel turning slowly, steadily, somewhere far away, or maybe just outside my window. I tell myself it's just my imagination, but the sound gets louder when I listen too closely. I've tried to convince myself that the road is safe again, that she's moved on, finally at rest. But sometimes, late at night, I wonder if she really found peace, or if she's still out there, searching for something more, waiting for another lost soul to wander down that dark highway. I can't help but think of the stories, the warnings, and I wonder, did she choose me for a reason? Did she see something in me? Some unfinished business that connects us still? I don't have the answers, and maybe I never will. But one thing is certain, I'll never forget that night on the Newell Highway, the chill in the air, the scream that rattled my bones, and the look on her eyes as she whispered for help. I left the shack, left the highway behind, but I can't shake the feeling that she hasn't let go of me. Not yet. Sometimes, in the quiet hours before dawn, I hear it again, the faint, rhythmic squeak of a trolley wheel, moving slowly closer. I tell myself it's just the wind, just the creaks of an old house settling. But deep down, I know better. The Pilliga Princess may have found some rest, but her story isn't over. And maybe, just maybe, she's not done with me yet. Have you ever felt a cold breath on your neck when you were all alone? Or seen something flicker in the shadows only to find nothing there? If you've experienced something that sends chills down your spine, we'd love to hear your story. Share your own paranormal encounters in the comments below and join a community that's just as fascinated by the unknown as you are. But remember, the stories we tell are crafted to thrill, entertain, and spark your imagination. While they may draw from real legends and eerie folklore, they remain works of fiction. Always stay curious, but also stay safe. Never venture into places that might be dangerous or off limits. If you enjoy exploring ghostly encounters, strange happenings, and tales that blur the line between reality and the unknown, make sure to subscribe to Haunting Chapters. We dive into the world of the mysterious every week, bringing you the spookiest stories and chilling adventures. Come along, if you dare, and become part of our group of brave souls who aren't afraid to peek into the shadows. Are you ready to uncover what lurks in the dark? We'll be waiting, if you're not too scared.